Imagine you haven't eaten in 3 weeks, not because you forgot to go to the store, not because you're trying some new diet you read about online, but because it hasn't rained at all for 2 months. And the crops your entire community planted, the seeds your family spent everything on, the field that was supposed to feed 30 people through a brutal dry season is turning to dust in front of your eyes. You have no weather app. You have no irrigation system. You have no backup plan. You have the sky, and the sky is not listening. So what do? Here's what ancient humans decided to do. They decided to get the sky's attention, and some of them, in some of the most remote and fascinating corners of human history, decided that the best way to do that was to hurt themselves. Not because they were crazy, not because they didn't understand the world around them, but because they had a logic, a deeply human logic, that made total sense given everything they knew and everything they believed. And understanding that logic, following it all the way back to its roots, tells you something extraordinary about what it means to be a human being trying to survive on a planet that does not care whether you live or die. This is the story of ancient rain rituals, the real ones, the ones that involved blood and pain and mud and screaming and dancing until your legs gave out and burying things that should not be buried and digging up things that should not be dug up, the ones nobody talks about at the dinner table, the ones that lasted for thousands of years across every continent on Earth because they worked, or at least they worked often enough. Let's start at the beginning. And the beginning, as it almost always does in stories about humanity, starts with fear. Part 1: The World Before Weather Forecasts. You need to understand something about the ancient world that modern people genuinely struggle to feel in their bones, even when they understand it intellectually. The rain was everything. Not important, not significant, everything. In a world before global food supply chains, before refrigeration, before wells drilled hundreds of feet into aquifers, before the 10,000 layers of technology that stand between a modern human and actual starvation, rain was the difference between a community living and a community dying. Full stop. No nuance. If it rained, the crops grew, the animals drank, the rivers filled, the children ate. If it didn't rain, those things didn't happen. And if it didn't rain for long enough, people died. Not metaphorically, literally. Communities collapsed. Populations were wiped out. Civilizations that had lasted centuries crumbled in a single dry decade. We have the archaeological evidence for this. We can see it in the bones. The Maya collapse, the Bronze Age collapse, the fall of the Akkadian Empire, which some historians now believe was triggered in significant part by a 300-year drought. 300 years. Imagine your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother being born into a drought, and your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren dying in it, and the rain still not having come back. The rain was not just important. The rain was the most powerful force in the universe, as far as most ancient humans were concerned. And the most powerful force in the universe needed to be communicated with, negotiated with, pleaded with, and if necessary, provoked into action. This is where it starts to get interesting, because the way humans across history have tried to communicate with the rain reveals something deep and consistent about how the human mind works. Not just ancient human minds, our minds. The same brain architecture that you are running right now, reading this, is the same one that looked at an empty sky 10,000 years ago and started trying to figure out how to make it rain. The conclusions were different, but the process was the same. And the process goes like this. Something big happens in the world, something that affects my survival. I cannot control it directly. So, I look for patterns. I look for things that have happened before the rain came. I look for things that the rain might want. I build a model of the universe that includes the rain as a kind of agent, a thing with preferences, with responses, with the ability to be influenced. And then I try to influence it. That's not superstition. That is the human brain doing exactly what it was built to do. Finding patterns, building models, taking action based on those models. The fact that the model was wrong, that rain is not an agent with preferences, that it cannot be negotiated with, does not make the people who built the models stupid. It makes them human. Let's talk about what that actually looked like in practice, because it is genuinely one of the most fascinating and varied collections of human behavior in all of recorded history. Part 2. The blood and the soil. Let's start with the most dramatic one first, because you came here for the dramatic one. In numerous ancient cultures across the world, from Mesoamerica to Africa to Southeast Asia, there existed a practice that modern people find genuinely difficult to look at directly. Ritual self-harm, performed specifically and deliberately to summon rain. Not punishment, not warfare, not anything with a victim who had done something wrong. Deliberate self-inflicted pain and blood offered to the sky. Why blood? Think about it from the inside of the belief system for a moment. You live in a world where everything is connected, where the spirits or gods or ancestors who govern the weather are not abstract distant beings, but present, watchful, responsive entities. You believe because everything you have ever been taught tells you to believe that what happens in the human world and what happens in the sky world are in conversation with each other. Blood is life. This is not a metaphor for ancient people. Blood is literally the substance that carries life. When you bleed, you are giving life. When you offer blood, you are offering the most precious thing you have. And if the rain is the sky's gift of life to the earth, then blood is the earth's gift of life to the sky. It is not random. It is symmetrical. It is reciprocal. It is the logic of exchange that sits at the foundation of nearly every religious system ever built. You give to the sky gives back. You bleed into the soil. The sky bleeds into the soil. The logic is not crazy. It is poetic, structured, and deeply internally consistent, given the cosmological framework it operates within. Now let's talk about specific practices, because the details are where this gets truly remarkable. The Maya, one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history, builders of cities and astronomical observatories, and a calendar more accurate than the one we used in Europe until the 1500s, practiced what scholars call bloodletting rituals, with a regularity that tells you everything about how central they were to Maya life. Maya kings and queens, the most powerful people in the civilization, would perforate their own skin, their tongues, their ears, with stingray spines or obsidian blades. They would collect the blood on strips of bark paper. They would burn the paper, sending the smoke upward. They would enter trance states, brought on partly by blood loss and partly by psychoactive substances used alongside the ritual. And in those trance states, they would meet the gods. They would carry messages. They would negotiate on behalf of their people. Rain was a central part of what they were negotiating for. Chaac, the Maya rain deity, was one of the most important figures in the entire Maya cosmological system. Entire architectural complexes were dedicated to him. The masks carved on Maya temples, those enormous stone faces with the curling nose that you've seen in photographs, those are Chaac. Everywhere, because rain was everywhere in the Maya mind. And the king's blood was not a punishment. It was a credential. It was proof of seriousness. It was the ancient equivalent of showing up to a negotiation with something valuable on the table. Here's what's remarkable. Across the Pacific Ocean, on the other side of the world, in communities that had zero contact with the Maya, you find structurally similar ideas. In parts of ancient sub-Saharan Africa, ritual specialists tasked with calling rain would undergo practices involving physical hardship, cutting, sleep deprivation, and fasting specifically as part of the process of making themselves worthy of communication with rain spirits. The physical ordeal was not incidental to the ritual. It was the ritual. The suffering was the credential. In ancient South Asia, texts describe ascetic practices, tapas, involving extreme physical endurance, performed specifically to generate spiritual power. And that spiritual power was understood to have real effects on the physical world, including the weather. The Sanskrit word tapas literally means heat. The heat generated by the ascetic's suffering was believed to accumulate as cosmic power that could force the gods to act. In ancient Mesopotamia, the earliest written religious texts describe rituals of prostration, weeping, and self-abasement performed before the storm gods Adad and Enlil. Not self-harm in the physical sense, but deliberate self-diminishment, making yourself small, making yourself nothing, because the logic was, if you are nothing and the rain still comes, then the rain is purely a gift from the divine, rather than something you earned. And gifts from the divine are more reliable than transactions. Different cultures, different methods, different cosmologies, but the same underlying move, making yourself vulnerable before the sky, making your suffering visible, saying, look at what I am willing to do, look at what I am willing to give, now look at what happens in the soil, and whether you think my crops deserve to grow. Part 3. The rain dance is not what you think it is. Let's talk about something that popular culture has turned into a cliché, and in doing so has almost completely misrepresented. The rain dance. When most people in the modern world hear the phrase rain dance, they think of something theatrical, something performative, maybe something slightly silly. A bunch of people jumping around hoping that movement will somehow convince clouds to form. That is not what a rain dance was. A rain dance, across the many cultures that practiced variations of it, was an act of total physical and spiritual commitment, lasting hours, sometimes days. It was not a performance, it was a conversation, and the currency of that conversation was exhaustion. Here's why exhaustion matters. In many ancient belief systems, the boundary between the human world and the spirit world was not a fixed wall. It was a membrane, and that membrane became thinner when the human body was pushed to itself. Extreme fatigue, extreme pain, extreme fasting, extreme cold or heat, these states were understood to be threshold states, states where the normal cognitive filters that keep everyday reality in place begin to dissolve, states where contact with the divine becomes possible. Modern neuroscience, interestingly enough, gives us some support for the idea that these states do something to human cognition. Extreme physical exhaustion, prolonged rhythmic movement, hyperventilation from sustained dancing, these things genuinely alter brain chemistry. They release endorphins. They suppress the default mode network. They produce states that people across history have described with remarkably similar language: a sense of dissolution of the self, a sense of presence, a sense of connection to something larger. Ancient people did not have the neuroscience to explain this, but they had the experience, and the experience was real. So when a community gathered and danced for 6 hours straight, until people were falling down, until legs were giving out, until the dancers were operating in a state that can only be described as altered, they were not just hoping for rain. They were doing something to themselves that they believed, based on real experiential evidence, genuinely opened a channel. The Hopi people of the American Southwest, who live in one of the driest environments on the continent, developed over centuries one of the most sophisticated systems of rain ritual in the world. Their ceremonies involve elaborate preparations lasting weeks, specific costumes and masks representing rain beings called Kachinas, dances that go from sunrise to sunset and beyond, and a level of community coordination and commitment that tells you everything about how seriously rain was taken. And here's the thing about the Hopi that should stop you in your tracks. Their agricultural system, developed over centuries of rain-dependent farming in an almost impossibly arid landscape, was genuinely remarkable. They grew corn in conditions that modern agricultural engineers study with considerable respect. Their deep planting, dry farming techniques were adapted to exactly the rainfall patterns of their region. The rain ceremonies were not separate from the agricultural knowledge. They were intertwined with it. The same calendar that dictated when to plant also dictated when to dance. The same knowledge system that told you where to plant also told you how to ask for water. The rain ritual was not an alternative to practical knowledge. It was part of the same system of knowledge, a system that understood the sky and the soil and the relationship between them with an intimacy that came from thousands of years of paying very close attention. And part of paying very close attention for many of these communities was paying with your body. Part 4. Digging, bleeding, and talking to the ground. Let's come back to the specific practice that opens this video, because it deserves more than a passing mention. Across multiple ancient agricultural communities, the ritual act of working the soil in rain ceremonies was not just symbolic. It was the point. Digging the earth with a tool and then striking yourself with that same tool, touching the soil and then touching your own skin, mixing your blood with the earth that you were asking the sky to water. This is not random. This is not violence for its own sake. This is the ancient articulation of a cosmological relationship. You, the farmer, the earth, your partner, the sky, the third party, whose cooperation you need. When you strike yourself with the tool you use to work the earth, you are not separating yourself from the farming. You are completing a circuit. You are saying, I am part of this soil. My blood belongs here the same way the rain belongs here. We are the same category of thing. We are both life that this earth needs to produce more life. In ancient Mesopotamia, agricultural festivals honoring the earth goddess Ninhursag involved ritual wounding of participants and ceremonies timed to the agricultural calendar. The wounding was understood as a kind of planting. Blood went into the earth the way a seed goes into the earth, with the expectation, the prayer, the hope that rain would come and make both grow. In ancient China, the dragon kings, the divine beings responsible for rain in traditional Chinese cosmology, were approached not just with offerings of incense and food, but with petitions that sometimes involved officials publicly performing acts of physical humiliation or hardship before the Dragon King's shrine. The logic was, if I, who am powerful, make myself small and suffering before you, then my request is real. Then I am not just going through the motions. Then you can see that I mean it. And across ancient Africa, in rain-calling traditions studied by anthropologists from the 19th century onward, the figure of the rain-caller, the specialist whose job was to bring rain, was almost always a person who had demonstrated willingness to suffer, who had gone through an initiation that involved physical hardship, whose authority came precisely from the fact that they had been broken open in some way and had come through it. Because if you have been broken open and you survived, then you have proved something. You have proved that you can go to the edge of things and come back. And that is exactly the quality you need in someone whose job is to go to the edge of the human world and come back with rain. Part 5, the animal question. Here's a dimension of this story that most people never think about. It was not always just humans who made the sacrifice. In ancient agricultural cultures from Egypt to India to the Americas, animals were central to rain rituals. Not just as food offerings burned on altars, but as symbols, as stand-ins, and sometimes in ways that tell you a great deal about how ancient people understood the relationship between living things and water. The frog is probably the single most universal symbol of rain in the history of human religion. This makes immediate, practical sense. Frogs appear when the rain comes. They are loud, and they are sudden, and they seem to emerge from nowhere. If you live in a world where you are looking very hard for patterns, the correlation between frogs and rain is impossible to miss. So frogs get incorporated into rain rituals across the world independently in cultures that had no contact with each other. In ancient India, texts describe rituals in which frogs were given brides, married off in elaborate ceremonies meant to mimic the wedding celebrations of the gods, with the specific intent of bringing rain. In ancient Mesoamerica, frog imagery is everywhere in ritual contexts associated with water and rain. In parts of ancient Africa and Australia, the sound of singing frogs was believed to actually be rain speaking, and rituals involving the mimicry of frog sounds were performed to call rain. Snakes, too, particularly those associated with water. In many ancient traditions, the serpent is the creature that lives in the boundary between the earth and the water beneath it. A creature that knows where the underground water is, that can go down into the earth and come back up. That kind of boundary knowledge made snakes powerful symbols in rain ritual contexts. And then there is the sacrifice of animals whose blood was explicitly poured into the earth. This was not just about blood. It was about the idea that the earth, having received life, would call to the sky to provide the water that makes life possible. The earth itself becomes an intercessor. The earth becomes the prayer. What strikes you when you look at all of this together is not the strangeness of it. What strikes you is the consistency. The same ideas, the same logic, the same cosmological relationships showing up in cultures separated by oceans and millennia and every other barrier that should prevent people from thinking the same thoughts. And the reason they thought the same thoughts is because they were looking at the same world. They all saw the same thing. Rain comes from the sky, and life comes from rain, and life comes from blood, and the earth connects all of it. Different cultures, different symbols, different rituals, same fundamental understanding of the relationships between things. Part 6, the weird ones. Let's take a moment to talk about some of the genuinely strange rain rituals, because history is full of them, and they deserve to be on the record. In medieval Europe, where the memory of older rain rituals had been partially absorbed into Christian practice and partially driven underground, there existed a fascinating collection of folk practices specifically aimed at bringing rain. In parts of rural France, when drought struck, villagers would go to the local saint statue. They would ask nicely, and if the saint failed to deliver, they would throw the statue in the river. This was not disrespect. This was negotiation. The logic was the saint is holy, and the saint presumably wants to be dry. If we put the saint in the river, the saint will be motivated to bring rain, so we will take the saint out of the river. It sounds almost comical, but think about it from the inside. If you genuinely believe that saints have agency and preferences and can intercede with divine forces, then the threat of getting wet is a real incentive. It is not silly. It is theological negotiation. In Russia and parts of Eastern Europe, there is a documented tradition of young girls being sent into fields naked and plowing furrows in the earth, specifically to bring rain. The nakedness was symbolic of openness, of having nothing hidden, of presenting the human body to the sky without any barriers. The plowing was the act of opening the earth and making it ready to receive. The two together were a kind of performed prayer. We are ready. We are open. Come. In ancient Egypt, the complexity of rain ritual is interesting precisely because Egypt was one of the few ancient civilizations that did not depend primarily on rain for its agriculture. Egypt had the Nile. The annual flood of the Nile, which deposited rich silt across the farmland, was far more important to Egyptian agriculture than rainfall. And yet, Egyptian religious texts are full of prayers and rituals aimed at controlling water, at pleasing Hapi, the god of the flood, at ensuring that the water came at the right time and the right amount. Because even in Egypt, the margin between enough water and not enough was terrifyingly thin, and the human response to that margin, across every culture and every time, was to try to do something about it. In ancient China, officials who failed to bring rain through official state rituals could face serious professional consequences. The rain ritual was not just a religious act, it was a civic responsibility. The emperor, who was understood to be the intermediary between heaven and earth, was personally accountable for the relationship between the sky and the soil. If the rain didn't come, it was evidence that something was wrong in the relationship, and the emperor had to fix it. This created some of the most elaborate institutional rain-calling infrastructure in human history. Official rain altars built at precise astronomical locations, ritual calendars specifying exactly which prayers were to be said on which days during drought, bureaucracies dedicated to the management of the sky relationship, a government bureau for rain. Let that sit for a second. Part 7. Does any of this work? Let's be honest about something, because this is the question sitting underneath everything else in this video, and it deserves a serious answer. Did any of this work? The short answer is, not in the way the people doing it believed it worked. The rain came or did not come based on atmospheric conditions, ocean temperatures, prevailing wind patterns, and the complex, chaotic systems of the Earth's weather. No amount of blood poured into soil has ever directly caused a cloud to form. No amount of dancing has changed the temperature of the Pacific. No frog wedding has altered the position of the jet stream. We know this. We have the physics. We have the meteorology. We can explain where rain comes from with a precision that would have seemed like magic to an ancient observer. So, the rituals did not work in the literal sense, but here is where it gets more interesting. They worked in other ways, multiple other ways, and those other ways were not trivial. First, they worked by maintaining knowledge. Many rain ritual calendars were also agricultural calendars. The ceremonies that told you when to pray for rain also told you when to plant, when to expect the first rains, when to harvest before the dry season. The ritual was the interface for the knowledge. You couldn't separate them. Abandoning the ritual often meant abandoning the knowledge it carried. Second, they worked by maintaining community cohesion under stress. Drought is psychologically devastating. It is a slow emergency that breeds despair, conflict, and disintegration. A community that has something to do together, a ritual that requires coordination and commitment and shared physical effort, is a community that stays together. And communities that stay together survive things that communities that fall apart do not survive. Third, they worked by maintaining hope. This one matters more than people want to admit. Hopelessness kills people. Not metaphorically, literally. People who give up on survival stop doing the things necessary to survive. A community that believes the rain is coming, that believes they have done what they can to call it, will hold on longer, will make their food supplies last further, will make better decisions than a community that believes nothing matters. The rain ritual, even when the rain never came, kept people alive longer. And a drought that your community survives is a different thing entirely from a drought that kills you. Fourth, and most speculative but also most fascinating, some of the physical practices involved in rain rituals may have had direct practical benefits that were attributed to the ritual but were actually mechanical. Digging the soil during a drought, which appeared in multiple rain ritual traditions, actually does things to the soil that improve its ability to absorb rain when the rain eventually comes. Breaking the surface crust allows water to penetrate rather than run off. Ancient farmers who dug ritually were actually preparing their fields. Burning things in drought conditions, which was central to many rain rituals, produces particulate matter that under some atmospheric conditions can actually influence local precipitation. This is a genuine meteorological phenomenon called cloud seeding. Ancient people who burned offerings on hilltops during droughts were not causing rain in the way they thought they were. But they were not entirely wrong that burning something had a relationship with rain. The rituals encoded practical knowledge in ritual form, and the practical knowledge was real, even when the supernatural mechanism was not. Part 8, The Last Rain Callers. Here's something that should stop you cold. This is not entirely ancient history. Rain rituals, including rituals involving physical pain, blood, and exhaustion, are not museum exhibits. They are living practices in communities across the world right now, today, in 2024. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, traditional rain callers, people whose role is specifically to maintain the relationship between the community and the sky, are active figures in community life. In some regions, they exist alongside weather services and modern agriculture, not as alternatives, but as complements. Because the people in those communities have learned over generations that the rain caller serves functions that a weather app cannot: community cohesion, cultural continuity, the management of hope in the face of uncertainty. In parts of South Asia, rain rituals tied to agricultural festivals have survived thousands of years of religious and political change. They have absorbed influences from multiple religious traditions, been adapted, reinterpreted, transformed, but not abandoned. In indigenous communities in the Americas, including in communities that have survived conquest, colonization, forced conversion, and cultural suppression that would have destroyed a less resilient tradition, rain ceremonies continue. The Hopi rain dances mentioned earlier are not historical events. They are present tense events happening in communities that have maintained them through everything the last 5 centuries have thrown at them. Why have they survived? Not because of supernatural efficacy. Not because the ceremonies demonstrably change the weather in ways that science can measure. They have survived because they do the other things, the things that turn out to matter at least as much and maybe more than the specific question of whether the clouds respond. They maintain the knowledge. They build the community. They sustain the hope. They mark the calendar. They give children a role in the life of their community and give elders a way to pass things down. They provide a framework for meaning in a world that is genuinely uncertain and genuinely dangerous and genuinely beyond the full control of any human being. And those things are not small. Those things are what civilizations are made of. Part 9. What it tells us about ourselves. We are almost at the end of this story, but before we finish, let's do what good history should always make you do. Let's look in the mirror, because everything in this video so far, every practice, every belief, every desperate attempt to communicate with an indifferent sky, these things were done by people who were not fundamentally different from you. Their brains were the same brain you have. Their emotional architecture, the capacity for fear and hope and grief and love, and the specific particular terror of watching something you cannot control destroy something you cannot replace. That was identical to yours. They did not have your knowledge, but they had your brain. And your brain, faced with an uncontrollable threat to survival, does exactly what their brains did. It looks for patterns. It builds models. It finds things to do. It looks for ways to feel like it has agency, even when real agency is limited or absent. Every time you knock on wood, you are participating in this tradition. Every time you have a lucky shirt. Every time you do the same thing before an important event because last time you did it, things went well. Every time you look at a situation you cannot control and feel the pull to do something, anything, even something that you cannot fully rationally justify, you are running the same cognitive software that danced until the legs gave out, asking the sky to open up. We do not call rain anymore, but we have not stopped trying to influence things that are beyond our direct control. We have not stopped performing rituals we do not fully understand. We have not stopped finding meaning in physical actions that connect us to outcomes we can only hope for. The ancient human who bled into the soil and looked up at the sky was not operating in a completely different universe from the modern human who does things that reason cannot entirely justify because it matters and because doing something is better than doing nothing and because the alternative is despair. We are continuous with them. We are them, wearing different clothes with different tools, living in a world those ancestors built with the labor of their bodies and the hope of their hearts. Part 10. The sky always answered. Here is the last thing. Eventually, for most of the communities who performed these rituals, the rain came, not because of the ritual, but the rain came, because the rain always comes eventually. The question of human survival has never been whether the rain comes at all. The question has always been whether you are still there when it comes. And the communities that had the rituals, the communities that had something to do together in the waiting, were more likely to still be there. The ritual did not make the rain, but the ritual helped make the people who were there to receive the rain when it finally fell. That is not nothing. That is, in many ways, everything. The next time it rains, really rains, that particular smell of water hitting dry earth, that smell that scientists have named petrichor but that every human being across all of history has recognized instantly as the smell of relief. Think about this. Across 10,000 years, in 100 different languages, in 100 different ritual forms, with blood and mud and dance and pain and smoke and prayer and tears, human beings looked at the sky and asked. They asked desperately. They asked beautifully. They asked with everything they had. And the sky, in its own time, in its own indifferent, magnificent, non-negotiable way, always answered. It always rained, and they were always there waiting. Across 10,000 years, humans offered everything they had just to be seen by the sky. Blood, pain, dance, tears, all we are asking for is a subscribe. Click the button, ring the bell, and we will see you in the next story.